the moderator for our next panel will be Amias Gerety, who has been a regular at our events. He is going to lead a panel on the API infrastructure, building fintech products today. And Amias is with QED Investors, a leading fintech investor group. Amias, I'm going to let you introduce your panel. So I'm going to step into the background here.
Excellent. Well, Howard and Nick, thanks so much for organizing this. And, you know, I feel like, Howard, I should be inviting you onto the panel because just this morning, the Supreme Court published a case in which I think this is the first time, but I'm not 100% sure, APIs are now written into the law of the land. So Stephen Breyer had a long discussion of APIs and fair use doctrine. I might ask the panel, I'll talk a little bit about this, although I will confess that my first action upon seeing this was to Slack Chris and say, Chris, what should I think? And apparently good news, according to Chris and the team at Treasury Prime. So we won't go too deep on fair use doctrine today, but it's kind of fun to have APIs in the news and also on your screens explaining what's going on.
Well, you were very prescient about raising this as a subject area, obviously, Amias, for the panel. And I would remind you, too, that there's a regulatory panel coming up later today, so you can have 2 bites out of that apple if you want to ask them about it. But have a go at it. I'm going to sign off here.
Excellent. Thank you again, Howard. So I'll start with quick introductions and premise before we get into the conversation. So just in a word, Christine is the CEO of Treasury Prime. Full disclosure, I serve on the board and am an investor in Treasury Prime. Treasury Prime is API first banking as a service platform. Ayo Omojola is the head of product for Carbon Health. By his own admission, it's quite a rocket ship. And I will confess that just yesterday, I used Carbon Health to find out where I might get a vaccine in the DC area. So Ayo is doing incredibly great work, even outside of the footprint where Carbon Health is really active. But Ayo is on this panel in large part because he's one of the really deep thinkers. So every couple months, Ayo will publish an essay on his website, and everyone makes me think deeply about fintech. And before that, he also was the product manager for the Cash App, which is the granddaddy of fintech apps right now. So he knows a lot about building. Rija Javed is an engineer now at Facebook, previously a CTO, and also a builder of the infrastructure behind Wealthfront, so a really experienced engineer. And then finally coming, what you might call out of left field, but really from the big leagues, is Leandra Fishman, because Leandra is the chief revenue officer at Intercom, and before that was at Twilio. And so for those of us in the API world inside of fintech, we really have to look up to the experience that Leandra and her colleagues have taken in really demonstrating that these API first companies can become software juggernauts. And so she'll tell us a little bit about the API world outside of fintech as well. So with those introductions, you know, I mentioned the Supreme Court case. I think the general premise for this panel is that as investors and as observers of the tech ecosystem, if not engineers or product people, we have largely come to accept that APIs are sort of a stand-in for modern tools, good building practices, good engineering. But I think we've actually underappreciated how important they are in terms of what they do to the ecosystem and in terms of what it takes to build a company that has APIs at the center or APIs at the front. And so with that, I'd like to just start with Chris. And Chris, maybe ask you the question. You've identified yourself as an API first company, right? You think of APIs as your primary product, but they're not your only product. And you could have identified yourself as a banking infrastructure player or a banking software player. Why API first? And what is that when you were conceiving of Treasury Prime? Why are APIs in the foreground in terms of how you define your company and how you build?
Sure, it's a good question. Thanks, Amias. Hi, everybody. So Treasury Prime exists because we see actually a change in the market, a change in how banking services are accessed, how money moves around in the US. And a lot of the things that are driving that change are developers and how they want to access the banking system more programmatically. So why are we API first? Because that's where our people are. We went to where they are. That I'm a developer as well. How do I want to think about this problem? I want to think about the banking system like an API. Here's the interface for all the stuff. And I can do all the stuff through this interface. Behind the scenes, it can be a mess. And, full disclosure, it is a mess. But it's, US banking. But I don't need to know that as a developer. I just need to know what's the interface, what's the contract, how does it look? I can tell you the Supreme Court ruling. I feel like I dodged a bullet, not so much for the company, but for my whole career. If, if APIs were suddenly copyrightable and people could do the things that clearly they want to do with them, I don't know what our industry would look like. It would just change overnight completely. I don't even know.
Say more about that, Chris, just on the Supreme Court. Is the threat here that if you weren't, that you'd have to ask Mother May I, and so the whole sort of ability for an engineer, and I'll go to Rija next, ability for an engineer to just start working with code would become imperiled if they were copyrightable? That's
my worry. Is Linux even possible, or do I have to go back to Bell Labs and say, hey, I know that in 1960, whatever, 70, whatever, you made this interface. Can I still use it? Or do I have to turn off my Macintosh? Because the Mac, it's Unix under the hood. All these things are just terrifying. If all of a sudden that I have to go back and ask Mother May I to every single player out there, because this is a complex world and we all hook together, just pulling on that thread, my sweater's going to come apart completely. I'll be lying on the floor before I know it.
So, Rija, turning to you a little bit as an engineer, so someone who's both built APIs and consumed them, what do you think that people like me, investors who sort of like to use the phrase API first or API, what are we getting wrong? And when you think about building something new, how do you start to lay out your toolkit, and how do you conceive of either APIs or other bits of technology in that toolkit?
Sure. I think it has to do with, it's not specific to APIs. It's pretty much the problem. The challenge becomes when you're stuck to a particular solution. So I used the example before, and we were talking about this before to some other people as well, particularly when I kind of like hear VCs or any startups PR a while back, at least when it was coming out, it's like, we're just using like blockchain and crypto, just because that was like a very hot buzzword. So API in some sense can kind of become the same thing where you think it's this cool buzzword. So if this company or whatever entity has that, then that automatically makes it seem like they're super cool. But just like anything else, it's just a particular solution. And not just looking at it in this particular space, but like when we're talking about solving some particular problem, it's more important to understand exactly what that problem is, what the actual customer need is, what are the constraints you're dealing with, what are the different trade-offs of the solutions that you're considering, and then arrive at a solution, as opposed to first being stuck onto a solution and thinking like that one solution, trying to shoehorn it into every particular thing. So that's kind of like the high level thing, because I do think there's other solutions like kind of like batch upload for SFTP that in many scenarios can work super well versus APIs that are also great, but have specific use cases.
And Rija, when you think about your role as an engineer and a builder in a company, if you have the opportunity to try and, build something by consuming somebody else's API, or build something by building a custom integration, or build something kind of by going out to the open web and sort of sucking it in without having someone else package it up for you, how do you view those trade-offs? Is it always preferable if someone has kind of built it first and you can just consume it, or do you get pressure from the business colleagues that you've got, like, hey, don't embed something that's going to cost me a lot of money when we run it to scale? Like, how much does that business stuff embed itself, or is the ease of use and speed to market just totally primary for you as a builder?
Yeah, I think with everything, you need to look at whatever the high level company goal is, right? And what are the constraints that you're dealing with. Some companies or products or areas might already have that product market fit. And it's more about, I don't know, you're trying to create more redundancy in terms of your solution. Or it is like a new product area for you, but the urgency is not necessarily as important there. Then you might be able to take like a much longer outlook, particularly with regards to like, hey, not just the immediate cost to be able to build it out in whatever time period, but the most important cost is actually with regards to like the maintenance and the overall stability. And that's just not on the operational side, which is engineering, which is client services, which is ops, legal, compliance, depending on exactly what that solution is, but obviously like the finances of the situation, right? And what's the end client experience going to be? So you have to kind of like weigh those trade-offs if you're able to have that longer term outlook. But if you have some, I don't know, a couple of people just getting together and they have this idea that they really want to try out and try to do their own thing, like, not even kind of like a seed stage type of thing, then like iteration and learning as quickly is the name of the game, right? And why do you want to reinvent the wheel if there's something like Plaid or TrueLayer in Europe or something that I can hook up with, and I know that actually is trying to get me that data, then for that quick iteration, that kind of makes sense. So it's hard to like come up with an immediate answer like, hey, like, you should kind of like go out and buy somebody else's, or you should build your own thing. Basically, you just have to kind of like weigh the pros and cons of the high level company goals and the constraints that you're under, both financially, both kind of like capacity, resource wise, and what that end goal is.
Ayo, sort of going up from engineering through to product, and starting with this last question of, is it, if an API exists that someone else has built to deliver whatever you need, whether it's bank account data or the ability to initiate a payment or the ability to serve, maybe even complex things like service a loan.
Yeah.
When is the answer just to say like, yes, I'm ready to go, I'll just pull it into the product I'm building? And when do you have to look closer and say, well, maybe I should try 7, maybe I should go around, maybe I should see if I can do it without paying somebody else? Like, as a product manager and designer, how do you wade through those trade-offs?
Yeah. I mean, I really would riff off what Rija said. I think she's right. From my perspective, the easiest answer is it depends. The more complex answer is, if you're building something that, if the API that you are contemplating, or the list of APIs that you're contemplating using, are not core to what you're trying to do, you kind of owe it to yourself to at least try them. Like, I get this question sometimes from founders they're like, hey, I'm trying to do something in payments. and we're gonna go this like really manual route and build this thing. And I'm like, hey, just use Stripe in 99% of cases. It will get you through your first 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. I actually, funny story for Leandra. I had somebody say to me recently in Carbon context that, we should just like do this ourselves instead of using Twilio. And I was like, have you lost your mind? Was my response. So like I almost, it's easy for me to say this because I'm not the person writing the code, but I almost kind of believe that before you ever try and roll your own, you should use the API that's available. And it might fail, but the relative cost of like going down the exploration and route of like trying to figure out something that a dedicated group of highly trained professionals have spent years of their lives optimizing is to just consume their product first, figure out where it breaks, and then figure out if you can live with the trade-offs before deciding to do it yourself.
Yeah. So Leandra, now zooming back out, we've talked to these consumers of APIs. Like you literally sell a product, and maybe I assume most people know what Intercom is, but maybe you can talk a little bit about it. But you sell a product which people implement just by consuming the API, and then they get a world of functionality behind that. How often do you have to sort of give people a firm shake, like Ayo said, and like, what are you, out of your mind? Like, just use my product. And how often do you actually have to, does the product just sort of fly off the shelves because once you've solved a problem and you can call the code, why would anyone try and build a call center or a chat functionality?
Yeah, I think that everyone's brought up such, good points, both Chris, Rija, and Ayo, really talking about just, we're not here to reinvent the wheel per se. We want something that works. We want something that's easy. We want something that's simple. And by putting in that initial infrastructure and having the ease and the flexibility and the reliability allows companies really to do actually what's in their best wheelhouse. And so a lot of times it's really just getting people to have that quick and easy ability to connect, as I kind of say, the pipes together in the infrastructure, and then have that quick kind of hits on then figuring out from their solution, when they're putting those together and they're building something, then what's really the sweet spot that they can continue to build on. And so I think that, as Ayo said, it's you can go one or two ways. You can make it hard or easy. And you can continue to iterate as you go and take on more complexity if you feel like you're not getting what you need.
So one of the things that I find really interesting is, and sort of just to draw this out, is one of the big theses for me as an investor is that the first generation of great software companies were defined by human to machine interaction. And the next generation of great software companies are going to be defined by excelling at machine to machine interaction, right? So they're going to have that API interface as the sort of preeminent thing that they're optimizing for. But when you start pulling on that thread, you eventually get back to people, because it is ultimately like engineers are people too, right? Product people are people too. And so I want to sort of turn it back to you, Leandra, and talk about the people side of this. When you and I chatted a week ago, I was asking, like, in a normal SaaS company, if you're trying to get your team to hit their numbers, you just say like, hey guys, like knock on more doors, more qualifying, more, just doing that Glenn Gary, Glenn Ross thing. In an API first company, you need engineers who don't really take sales calls to start implementing your work. So I think what you need is this tool to start to have a little bit of a community around it. So I'd just be interested, Leandra, in your experience, like, how much work can a company do to create that community around itself? Do those communities have to be organic in order to work? What are some of the tools that you would use? Look, you've been in highly successful companies. I'm sure your CEO has said to you, Leandra, I've got to hit these numbers. How do you make those numbers happen as a chief revenue officer in a world where demand is sort of structured to be organic rather than inorganic?
Such a great question, because I think if you look at a lot of the great API companies, they really have been built on a self-serve developer-led platform. And that's why we're talking about the ease of being able to solve problems and connect pieces together as fast as possible. That's really where the magic happens, because you're right, developers do not want to be sold to. They want to build things and they have ideas that they want to connect pieces together. And if we allow them to do that, the beauty is if you can build your revenue model that is based off the organic growth and it's really connected to the usage, and the usage is solving problems and providing value, it starts to create its own wave. And so I would say by going to developers in their communities and getting them to, have the experience, that's really where the connection's made. And riding the revenue wave has a lot to do with just obviously the different feature functionality that they can enable through those APIs, but really taking advantage and making sure the customer problem that you're solving and what they're building is connected to their usage and their success. That's the easiest way to grow revenue.
Yeah, I think as an investor, and I think many of the people who are listening are seed or angel investors, this is actually a little bit unusual, and it's more different than traditional SaaS than we might think. One of the beauties of SaaS is predictability, right? If you are a SaaS company, you just don't have a spike in December, right? Salesforce, you get paid the same amount month over month. That's sort of like not that I'm the world's greatest expert on Salesforce, but this predictability and the net revenue just incrementing up in a nice linear fashion. But if you take advantage, Leandra, of this organic growth and usage base, you're accepting both more concentration and more volatility. And so as you talk to investors, and maybe Chris, as you talk to me, as you tell this story, how are you finding, or do investors understand this? Because, I think people got excited about just like SaaS, beautiful, pristine, smooth, like you can project that out to infinity, but usage, it can go really huge as a wave, but it can also be spiky and volatile. So Chris, like what are you saying to investors, and how much do investors understand the difference between usage-based and API-based sort of economics and SaaS economics?
Yeah, the API business can be lumpy, that's for sure. As you get more clients, it smooths out, but you can only, if you zoom in, you can still see how crazy it actually is. Depends on the investor, like there's unsophisticated ones and sophisticated ones, and the unsophisticated ones just want to see the chart, want it to hockey stick. Great, I'm done. Stop thinking now. But most of the
Put me in that camp, Chris. That's what I want to see.
That's good. The sophisticated ones, like they know that they have to look under the hood, because what's driving this? Like, how concentrated are you, right? There are certainly API companies where their majority of the revenue is like within just a handful of clients. And then there are others who are more spread out. I think everyone's in a power law, but it's like, how concentrated and squashed is that at the top? And so my take is that, yeah, a good investor has figured this out by now. 5 years ago, maybe not, longer ago, when Twilio was like, couldn't catch a break, even though it's obviously a great idea. But everyone's learned that by now. Everyone's learned that happens. Like, there's seasonality in my API, right? Like, people do less banking stuff, in the holidays in December. I have a dip every year. I don't like it. I can yell at people. It's still going to happen, right?
Now, Ayo, you're also an angel investor. Hey, sorry.
Life in the pandemic, eh?
That's right. That's Susie, my colleague. She's in our internship program. She does code review on Thursdays. Anyway, so Ayo, as an angel investor, how do you look at this? These companies. I know we've done some investing together.
Yeah.
But how do you think about the this generation, do you agree with me, and you don't have to, that there's something going on generationally in terms of newer companies that are even more focused on this? Or is this just one more theme among a huge boom in fintech where there's going to be lots of exciting companies? Like how attracted are you to these tool-based companies versus any other type of company you could look at as an angel?
Yeah. I'm insanely attracted to them. I think
I was reading The Witness.
Yeah, exactly. That was a very, very leading question. So my kind of perspective on it is the analog that I always use is there's a thing that's true about I think you said this a bit backwards. There's a thing that's true about companies that are API first or API only. That's way less true about SaaS companies, which is you get to embed this concept of a power law dynamic that's like very familiar to the VC crowd. So if you think of a company like Stripe, I would say actually, I remember the thing that really nailed this in my brain was actually when Twilio went public. And I think there was like a stat going around about how WhatsApp was like 15% of their either volume or revenue or something like that. And the way that I think about this is, if you think of a company like Stripe, a thing that makes Stripe work among many things is once a year, a company comes along that in a decade will do $1 billion in revenue or we'll do billions in volume. And fundamentally, Stripe isn't, if you think of Lyft, Shopify, Target, like these massive companies that like live on Stripe, are they the companies where Stripe makes the margin? Probably not. But they are the companies where the economies of scale are present. And once they scale to that large, dislodging something like Stripe is actually fairly difficult. So what ends up happening is you have the compound effect of Stripe's been around for 11 years or 12 years or whatever. So they've had 12 years of at least one company a year that's like doing billions in volume for them. And then they have a long tail of millions of customers that do like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And that's where all the margin is. But the power law customers drive actual scale economics for them, and then they monetize those scale economics on everyone else. And so my perspective is, I personally am not as worried about the lumpy nature. I'm just much more interested in once you're like embedded at that level where you're replacing what would be a whole team of people who are extremely specialized working on something that's not core to your business, and you're a massive customer. Like, could you switch off Stripe or Twilio? Yeah, sure. Like, anything is possible in the theoretical world. But now you're like going to your CFO and you're like, hey, by the way, I need to do this random investment. There's like some risk because you don't know what you're going to find when you like, in the Twilio example, when you like go talk to a random engineer at T-Mobile and you're like, hey, we want to do this thing. And the guy's like, I don't know what you're talking about, dude. So my perspective is I don't want to say it's a fairly new dynamic. I think the first place I saw it was Twilio. I bet there's other examples. I haven't been around that long, but I think it's an even more powerful and compelling dynamic than like the SaaS recurring revenue thing in many ways.
Yeah, the idea of, can I get a structure that systematically buys lottery tickets with something like better than even odds? That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
And by the way,
I
think it actually, like, my bet is for a lot of these companies that are customers of Twilio and Stripe, it probably unlocked a ton of value unrelated to what it did, because you all of a sudden had a ton of this productive capacity freed for offense. That wasn't like, hey, can we just keep the lights on for this thing? They were like, hey, Twilio will keep my lights on. Like, I know that text message is not going to fail. So I think I remember seeing something, some metric somewhere, I just don't know exactly where it was, where some company switched over to Stripe from Global Payments or some kind of legacy player.
Yep.
And they, prior to switching over, they had like 400 engineers working on payments. And they went from like 400 to like 30 over the course of a year and a half. And that's, there's no founder, CFO, like there's literally no senior person in a company you would look at that would look you in the eye and be like, yes, I prefer having 10x more people working on, just make sure we get paid.
I can't tell you how many people have told me that Stripe is lucky because they got Lyft early on. Boy, that was lucky. It's like, it was lucky. They're set up to be lucky, right? Yeah. Their whole structure is that they're going to be lucky all the time.
Yeah.
Right. Totally
well,
true.
I will say I recently reread. So we were investors in Braintree, and at the time it seemed like a great investment when we sold. Now, now in light of Stripe, it looks like maybe we sold too early. But I remember the investment memo said, year on year gross, net dollar retention. And that number was 185%. And then there was year on year gross dollar retention, excluding Living Social. And that number was like 117%. Right. So it just to your point about the power law, right, is that this was a company that was growing fantastically by traditional metrics, but growing insanely by the actual thing that it did, which it caught Living Social in this growth. So I want to transition as one final topic, sort of the downside here. And I know I get asked this question every time I look at a company in this space, which is what you might call the graduation question. And Ayo, you touched on it, but I want to turn this to Rija and say, Rija, I'm sure that at different points in your career and today inside your current job, there are business analysts coming to you and saying, no, for real, how hard would it be for us to rip out provider X and just handle it ourselves? Like, you're currently at Facebook, you don't have to talk about internal and Facebook dynamics, but my understanding is Facebook has a lot of engineering resources and also a lot of cash. That's just cursory understanding. Wealthfront also was a place that increasingly had large resources and was a winner in its own right. What is your dialogue like with those business analysts who come to you and say, okay, Rija, but for real, how could we rip out X or Y or Z?
I think it's always important to have aspirations. I try to bring the conversation back to what I answered earlier with regards to like API for everything is like, okay, let's look at the constraints that we're functioning under. Like, this is what we're trying to achieve. Even for something like super simple, if you think we can do this, this is the number of engineers I have. One of my favorite things, particularly at Wealthfront, was like just to pull up like not just our existing roadmap, but the backlog of requests that I had from like other XFN as well. And it's like, okay, well, this is what everybody else is asking for, and this is what we currently have on the roadmap. And you've just brought me something from left field, which let's look at the numbers here. But I look at it as a positive conversation, like that they have belief in the company, in the various different functions, particularly in the engineering team, that they think that this is something that we could do. I don't think it makes sense for us to do, but they think we could do. It's been also interesting to see how the conversations change, because in my past companies, it's been partnerships that you do with them versus at Facebook level, it's like, okay, as opposed to adding like, 10 engineers or 15 engineers and working on this for like 6 to 8 months, we just need to like fast track it. So like, we're looking into like acquiring these companies. I'm like, okay. Like, I've been at places where people have been like, oh my God, we got like $2 million in like, this initial seed funding, or even if like however much, like 20 million. And you guys are just for like this small kind of measly-ish team just talking about like acquiring a company for nothing. Not
for nothing to their investors, Rija. Not for nothing to the.
There's that, yes.
Well, this is, Howard just put a great question in the chat, and I'll turn it to you, Rija and Ayo, as the consumers on the panel. what verticals are still ripe for API insurgency? So I think if I asked Chris this question, he would say banking as a service and raise his hand as the insurgent. But Ayo and Rija, when you look out at the landscape, things that, you know, if you were starting another fintech company, or Ayo obviously in healthcare right now, what do you wish there was? Just like, boy, I wish there was an API for blank.
Wait, or sorry, Ayo, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead. I have to think.
I think this could fall under API insurgencies, or just like generally what I think would be cool solutions to have. And you know, Vaultfront has some solution kind of like closer to this, and I've heard a bunch of friends, particularly here in London as well, like try to tinker around with some of these ideas, but trying to come up with like more curtailed solutions for each individual, in the sense like, you know, Vaultfront is like has been trying to do like this financial planning, right? And they try to take into account like, okay, like morbidly, like I don't know, like these are the dependents I have, this is potentially when I might maybe even die, and like, you know, how much I want for retirement type of thing. But I think kind of like personalizing it a little bit more with regards to like truly taking in like all of my consumer data as much as possible. The closest thing that I've seen to that in a way is Monzo. But I think there's still more to be seen there. I'll raise my hand up. Like, you know, I have a Monzo account, but I don't actually use it like regularly for my day-to-day stuff. Like I have another banking account for that, but it's really great in terms of foreign transactions here. But what's really cool is like, you know, it's able to kind of like budget. It's like, oh, like that was for transportation, or you did that for groceries, or like, you know, I don't know if I had like a health expense or something, or so like I went to a place, or entertainment. Obviously that's not happening anytime soon, or hasn't happened, unfortunately. But I think that part is really cool. And I don't know, I don't work at Monzo, but I think a next step to that would be like trying to, after you've ingested all of that data, to be able to make better recommendations in terms of on a short-term basis how I should budget, which I think to some part Monzo tries to do, but more in terms of like the future planning for how I should be making like my financial plans. Because a lot of solutions, unfortunately, and I'm gonna harp on a little bit about the D&I stuff, is like many of the solutions are curtailed to a specific customer base, which sometimes tends to be a middle-aged white male. And we all come from different backgrounds. We all have different lives. And it would just be really, really cool to see solutions that are more curtailed towards the different lifestyles and backgrounds.
Yeah,
that's a great one.
Ayo,
what would you add?
Yeah, so I, you know, I'll talk my own book for a bit. I think like the framework that I use, because we're sort of thinking through some API products for Carbon as well. The one framework that like seems to be working that I've kind of only arrived at in the last few weeks is taking anything that is, it's basically taking anything that's asynchronous and making it real time. Is like one framework. And so there's things like, you know, there are processes that exist in tons of environments, not just financial services or healthcare, where there's a decision that needs to be made. It's just an algorithm that happens to run in a human's brain, and the latency is just driven by how much that human can process working, you know, a regular 8-hour day. And so we see like there's tons of things in healthcare, like billing, claims processing, claims adjudication, managing provider credentials that are just like you submit a form to the government, and a person in the government like checks information in that form against the database and processes it. So I think like there's the asynchronous to real time thing is like one axis, and then the second axis is information versus actions. And so I think even just things that are, you're just asking for content and it takes a while to get an answer, and making that real time is hugely valuable. But being able to complete an action in real time, you just imagine the compound effect of everything in your environment that's slow, that's just like a formula, like making it instant means that you can get many more turns of that thing over the course of like in a given time period. And payments is a great, like, it's just like one of the great ones of like, if you take ACH and you collapse it from 2 days to a day, what you've actually done is, to a payments geek, it's real-time payments. To a consumer, it's working capital, reduces their need for credit, unlocks tons of consumer surplus, et cetera. So there's tons of things like that. And then like on the information side, I would say the benefit of taking information that has high latency and making it real time, taxes are kind of the current example of this in my brain, is you can now make decisions that you might only have made later, right? And so if you think of things like, I was talking to a founder the other day who I'm not going to share the thing that they're doing, but essentially if you think of what people with a lot of wealth are able to do around optimizing taxes, around like securities, tax loss harvesting, things like that. If you don't have a huge securities portfolio, you can't do that. And that's like most humans. But there are tons of mechanics that a low-income person can optimize from a tax perspective, like short of getting credit, that are available. And in order to do that, they need to know like, hey, here's what my real-time tax position might be at any point in the year. And so they're creating that thing. So it's the best high-level heuristic I have for it is that, but I think like literally almost anything is available for API disruption if you approach it through that lens.
Hey, that's a really terrific explanation. I raised the question partly for personal reasons, because I've been talking to, I do a lot of workshops apart from fintech, and so there are a lot of verticals I bump into. But there's a company that I've been talking to in the ag tech area, right? And so they have created an API for farmers. And farmers, as you can imagine, are a little bit far away from most tech companies and tech solutions. And so the applications and the programmers or the developers that serve farmers don't have very good access to their data. And so now there are a couple companies out there that are trying to basically harvest farm and farmer data and then provide it to the application providers that can then make the life of farmers easier. And those application providers, of course, they don't want to have to, figure all this out themselves. And so it's a very similar concept. So that's the reason I asked the question about, well, what else is there out there like this? I mean, obviously, farmers are a pretty good example of this, but there's probably a lot of other stuff out there.
Yep.
Well, I love one of the things that attracts me to this space is, using the old jobs to be done framework. One thing that happens in kind of traditional software is that the screen is feature rich. And because the screen is feature rich, teams sometimes can sort of do what you might call like the hand wave over the job to be done. Well, this is a screen that allows you to, have a dashboard for your financial life. And when you collapse something to an API, you lose the benefit of that hand wave. You lose the benefit of having like a very charismatic salesperson who could work for Leandra, but you gain the benefit of, an engineer's rigor. Okay, so I call this and I get what back? And I think that piece of it can really be a powerful unlock, especially for early companies, because it really tries to isolate, well, what is the thing that you are doing? And I think, especially to use your example, Howard, of whether it's ag tech or something else, there are all sorts of jobs to be done. And if you collapse it to an API, you really need to narrow down on what is the one thing that you're going to start serving and delivering through computer code. And that can be a very high pressure gauge to figure out. But once you figure it out, you really know whether you have product market fit or not, because either someone wants that one little thing or not. There's no hand waving that's possible. And I think that makes it very attractive. So I know, Howard, we have to stay more or less on time, but are there, so I'll just open it up, sort of final comments, messages that people wish, you guys are inside and you hear people talk about this on the outside. What do you wish people understood about the front lines of fintech product or APIs?
I can say that I wish people would stop treating it as a special new thing. It is the old thing. If product matters, design still matters. It's now just API design. Like this is true of all the examples. The reason Treasury Prime's API works is it just removes friction from the system. That's all it's really doing. Like it makes the hard things easy, and so people can get on with their lives. That's all we do, and that's no different, I think, than any technology product from mobile phones, the internet, whatever. That's my thought. It's not different. It just has funny letters in front.
New brand.
I can't underscore Ayo's point about infrastructure that works. When it's sticky, the last thing people want to do is do a rip and replace. And so just really making sure it's a great customer experience, make sure it works. You can work out all the business economics later. And I agree with Ayo's point. I want to partner with Ayo because I feel like he's on the same page that I am. But it's just like really understanding the nuances of those different segments and those needs. All big companies start out small. So when you make it easy for customers to build on your products, then you can ride them up with their success, and just really think it's important that we're giving customers a great experience.
That's terrific. And look, I just want to appreciate Howard for having us, and Chris, Ayo, Rija, and Leandra for joining. This has been very fun, and now we're all Supreme Court experts. So for the rest of the day, you can say that today was a great day for software in the Supreme Court, according to Christine.